When people are forced to leave their homes, oftentimes in the middle of the night, with very little of their possessions, particularly when they have to cross borders and enter into a new legal jurisdiction, they are trapped in this existential state of limbo. This ability to sort of prove you are who you say you are, or you've done the things that you say you've done, and you're reliant on just simple attestations, makes it very, very challenging to be able to unlock access to the most basic services.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders actually are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Colin Walsh, founder of Civitas ID. Colin last joined us on the podcast when he was the CEO of Varo Bank, where he built one of the most significant digital banks in the United States, focused on expanding access to fair, affordable financial services. But with Civitas ID, Colin's now tackling a more foundational problem. For hundreds of millions of people around the world, the issue isn't access to financial services. It's the inability to prove who they are in a way that systems recognize. This is a story about identity, infrastructure, and what it takes to move from exclusion to participation at a global scale. Colin, it's really great to have you back on the Purposeful Strategist.
Belden, it's wonderful to see you, and it's terrific to be back speaking with you and your audience about the work we're doing at Civitas.
Great. Just to sort of set the scene, kind of in really simple terms, what happens today when somebody tries to cross a border without portable ID? Sort of what are the sorts of problems they face? Where does the system break?
Let me maybe even step back a little bit further and talk about the problem we're trying to solve broadly, context as to why I've tried to tackle this. So we're seeing across the planet right now an exponential growth in the number of people that are being forcibly displaced. And so could be the result of war, conflict, persecution. It could be the result of the increase in frequency and severity of climate events. But when people are forced to leave their homes, oftentimes in the middle of the night, with very little of their possessions, particularly when they have to cross borders and enter into a new legal jurisdiction, they are trapped in this existential state of limbo. So if you imagine, and you could be anyone from, a farmer in a rural community to a doctor working in a hospital who has to gather your family and leave. And when you go into a new legal jurisdiction, this ability to sort of prove you are who you say you are, or you've done the things that you say you've done, and you're reliant on just simple attestations, makes it very, very challenging to be able to unlock access to the most basic services. I mean, initially it's about feeding yourself and your family and having shelter and access to emergency care. But then it goes beyond that to starting to think about rebuilding your lives and having goals around getting your children into schools and education and accessing quality housing and healthcare and just being able to move money. And if you're entrepreneurial and you want to start a business, getting financing for that business. So all of these foundational things to be able to actually rebuild your life and participate in any economy. And if you're now in a new geography, I think people are kind of giving up on the idea that there's going to be immediate repatriation, either going home because of some of the conditions that exist in the countries of origin, or being repatriated to the United States or Europe or other places, given current policies around immigration. So I think people are starting to say, well, I'm here for the distance, and how do I start to contribute in the economy where I am? And so much of it is locked in this identity cycle. And there's a few things that we've been focusing on, and we can go into much more depth on this. But one aspect is the technology, lack of interoperability. There's operational, there's technical issues. Systems don't talk to each other. Can you create digital manifestations of identity credentials and verify those credentials? But a lot of it is also around policy reform and making sure that there's actual recognition of certain types of credentials. What is the status, the regularization status of individuals? Are they asylum seekers? Have they been granted asylum status? Do they have appropriate residency permits in different jurisdictions? All of these rules are different, but aligning them intent of how do you help these communities start the process of integration? And it's a political hot potato as well, because for governments, they don't want to be seen as, particularly if they have their own economic issues, giving jobs to people who've moved into the country in favor of citizens. And so how do you get around that in terms of thinking about leveraging and tapping the skills and capabilities of these communities to actually create jobs or create attractive incentives for businesses to come in and employ not just the migrant and refugee populations, but the citizen populations as well. And so trying to think through all of these are hugely complex issues. And we could talk more about the origin of kind of why started to try to tackle this.
Well, actually, if you don't mind, I want to dive right into that. I mean, here's this enormous problem. What is it about you, your background, your personality? What led you at some moment to go, that's my problem. I'm the right guy to step right into the middle of this?
Well, I think, across my career history, I remember being in my 20s and interviewing with the vice chair of Wells Fargo at the time. And she was like, I have these different jobs. Which one do you want? I want the hardest one. I want the most difficult one. And I've kind of always sort of leaned towards that. And so I've spent, the better part of my early career building new products in the financial services space to try to, help people, whether it's climbing the housing ladder or being able to access, new rewards and benefits on payments products or being able to find new savings solutions to help people build greater resiliency through savings in the established financial system. I think I eventually felt like, wow, this is great, but I'm serving populations that already have a head start, whether it's, in terms of solid jobs and income or some form of wealth that they're just trying to leverage in the financial systems. At the time I was living in London, decided to move back to the United States to start Varo Bank, which you alluded to at the beginning of this discussion, which was very much around helping more marginalized, underserved, some cases systemically blocked populations from being able to access the formal banking system and providing them with a platform and a robust set of products to have more control of their financial lives. And so building a bank, using technology, working with government institutions to try to create something really quite meaningful for populations that had been underserved. And Civitas was a little bit of the next stage in that journey of saying, okay, well, what are some of the even bigger problems globally that people are facing at scale? And through conversations with people at the World Bank, USAID at the time, saying, if you can help solve this issue around forced displacement and being able to help so many, it's 124 million. I think right now, today, it's probably more like 130 million people who've been forcibly displaced, sort of be able to restore that dignity and start to be able to leverage their skills and talents and capabilities wherever they reside, to be able to start to give them access to the services to rebuild their lives. And so that's what ultimately led to it. But I think there's a long history of kind of trying to solve complex issues and starting to find pathways for inclusion and helping people who have not been served well by established systems to be able to get much more dignified access to them.
Colin, if you don't mind, one of the things that strikes me about that story is it's an interesting sort of combination of finding a big problem and bringing a lot of background and obviously people you've met and got to know over the years and, a reputation you've built together without necessarily a terribly, sometimes people come up with this vision that you can tell it's a fantasy. We're never going to get there. What I hear you're saying is there's some systemic problems here that we can begin to address and make it better. I may not be able to solve the fact that people are being forcibly displaced, but I can at least make it so when they get to wherever they've been displaced to, they've got a way back into being a part of the system, being able to contribute, being able to participate. I just think for me that's slightly different from what I've heard some people when they talk about when they take on a really big problem. That you're starting, it sounds to me like in a very grounded way.
Well, a couple of things you said there. One, and I've been very clear with many of the stakeholders we've engaged with since starting this a little over a year ago now, that this is not just a techno-utopia vision like, okay, some guy from Silicon Valley is going to drop in and sort of give you all the answers. I mean, I think we've iterated with different prototypes and different ideas. And when we actually share them with refugees and migrants, they look at it and say, yeah, wow, that would be a miracle if you could make that happen. But the reality on the ground is this, we have to go through all of these bureaucratic hoops. There's all this indignity embedded in the processes that exist today. And so unless you can solve that, you can build the best technology in the world, it's not gonna actually meaningfully move the needle. And one of the things that I'd say, if I look back just over the last year, that I find very pleasing is the convening power that Civitas has in terms of being able to bring the right people together. And there's two markets that we're focused on. One is in Kenya and the other is in Colombia. And we've now held at least 10 or more roundtable conversations starting at the UN General Assembly, where we kicked off last September. And then we were at the fall World Bank IMF meeting. We've brought together stakeholders in Kenya several times. I actually just got back from Kenya a few weeks ago, and we had a roundtable conversation in partnership with Strathmore University. And there were people represented from government, from the World Bank, from the major NGOs, the refugee communities. And it was a very open, powerful conversation around what are the pathways to addressing some of these issues that we've laid out these identity barriers. Similarly, we've done a number of these in Colombia as well to really stress test the reality of what we're trying to do and say, okay, what is it going to take? And it's not just a technical solution. There's advocacy work. There's trying to make sure that we're effectively communicating to stakeholders the vast potential and also the severity of the issues that are being faced by these populations, and trying to shift that narrative to these populations. There could be job creators, they're not job takers, and trying to get other people to understand that. Then there's the policy work and really the changes that need to be made legally and from a process perspective and an administrative perspective. I mean, a good example is like in Kenya, you still need to have physical signed documents to be able to satisfy KYC. So you have in person, but if you had a verifiable digital credential, why couldn't that qualify, particularly if it's been through a multi-tiered verification process as a way to KYC to open up a bank account or open up a mobile money solution? And so one of the conversations we're advancing is to get with the right stakeholders and talk with the central bank around, let's at least run a sandbox and see what's the worst that could happen if we let, a few thousand people into the system through a set of verifiable credentials. Let's read the results. And if it's actually successful and it's eliminating lots of costs and administrative burden and it's improving financial inclusion and economic participation, why wouldn't we run with that? Because, I was in Kenya, 2-3 weeks ago, we talked about building a prototype of a resource portal for refugees where they can see all the information they need around the documents that are required. And here we are. We actually have a prototype already built in just a couple of weeks. And it's amazing. And, but having the technical people that can run with these things when you give them the requirements, but then making sure you bring all those other parties along.
So I just want to go back to one or two things you said, just in case anybody's not fully on the inside of some of this stuff. KYC, if I've got it right, is know your customer, which is, I assume, a regulatory requirement in lots of jurisdictions. And if I've got it right, what you're really putting your finger there on is that whole problem of you don't have a bank account. So because you don't have a bank account, you can't get a job. Because you can't get a job, you can't have an address. Because you don't have an address, you can't have a bank account.
And it's these cycles that go on and on. Well, actually, a really good example is in Kenya, you need to have something called an M-class work permit to be able to get a job. You need a work permit to get something called a KRA pin. There's a KRA pin. There's this sort of document chain. And if one piece in the chain breaks, everything falls apart. And so, but a good example, and this is one of the policy things we're looking at, is to get this M-class work permit, you need to have a job. Well, who's going to give you a job if you don't have a work permit? And so you get in this cycle that it's like, well, how do we say okay, let's apply for the work permit, explain why the individual wants and needs the work permit. Let's streamline the process for getting it. If we can actually verify this person is who they say they are, they have the skills they claim to have, and using technologies that can allow us to proof that and validate that, and then get them access to that work permit. And maybe there's different tiers of work permits that could be available. But that then allows them to get the job. It allows them to open the next step of what are the documents required to get the bank account, to get the loan. If you want to not just do day work, you have a business that you want to support and you need financing for that business. And so kind of working through each of these things. And again, it's not just a technology solution, because I think we can build, and we've already proven that we can build the technology pieces to make this happen. It's really around the policies and the processes and the interoperability of data, where data sits in different databases, and trying to bring all those pieces together. And that's what gets me very excited, is because, there's been a lot of work across the world. India is probably the best example of like the India stack, and taking 1.2 billion people and moving them into the formal systems through the, Aadhaar, which is the identity system, and UPI, which is the payment system, and DEPA, which is the data interoperability system. And so you also see initiatives happening in other parts of the world, but a lot of this has been all geared towards citizen populations. And so the kind of DPI, or digital public infrastructure, that Civitas and Etimos are a sister company, which we can talk a little bit more, infrastructure for these populations on the move. And again, as they're growing exponentially, it becomes a huge opportunity for countries and governments to have more people on the tax rolls and participating in the countries, but also for private practice. So if you're a financial institution or a non-bank lender company or an employer or a healthcare organization or an education platform, these are hundreds of millions of people that you can be, that were just pretty much out of reach before this sort of digital infrastructure and some of these policy reforms go into effect.
So if you can, talk us through Civitas. And then you mentioned Edimos. So where are each of them? How big are they? What are they designed to do? If they relate to each other, how do they relate? Just talk us through all of that.
Yeah. So Civitas was the initial undertaking. So when I said that I wanted to create something that could help solve this problem, I set up Civitas as a 501c3. We've got a formal U.S. IRS designation as a nonprofit entity, focusing on pathways to solve this problem. As I mentioned, kind of the three major pillars of our work around advocacy, policy reform, and building digital public goods, which is digital infrastructure, open source technologies like governments and multilaterals and NGOs and others could build on top of. And we're already now pretty far along in terms of defining kind of the open source components and working through those components. As I mentioned, we've built several prototypes now for both Kenya and Colombia, putting in motion real pilots, working with both the kind of NGO communities as well as in Colombia, for example. We're pretty far along in conversations with some of the municipalities and government entities to actually put something in market, get migrant communities, refugees working on some of the platforms that we're building. So that's Civitas. Where Etimos comes into play is, as we were going deep into this, we realized that we could build this sort of trusted distribution layer with partnerships with NGOs, community-based organizations, refugee-led organizations, sort of try to tackle some of these tough issues around how to get documents renewed, how to orchestrate connecting documents between government agencies and third parties and all of that, which incredibly powerful. But in and of itself, it wasn't really addressing the fundamental issues of the private practice participants. And this is where, to your point, like having been in this industry for a long time, I'm kind of putting myself in the shoes of a bank or a lender or a money remittance provider and saying like, well, okay, this all sounds really good, but you're just basically ingesting credential information and you're sending it to me, which is fine, but I still then have to run through all my processes to decide, is this a valid identity? What is the real risk of this person? And there's still a lot of work and effort. And so what's where Etimos comes in, it's a public benefit corporation, so very mission aligned to Civitas, also very focused on trust and do no harm, making sure that everything is consent based, that, we're following all the kind of privacy preserving technologies because these are very vulnerable populations, but with the user's consent, being able to actually start building models that say, okay, based on everything we have like a 99% assurance that you are who you say you are. We've looked at all your information. We've been able to build a model that says, you know what, everything sort of checks out. You've provided us with enough information that we can confidently say. And so there's that next level of identity proofing and verification. So that dramatically decreases the cost of acquisition for all of these service providers. So you're having like something that really is, and again, we're going to have to run a lot of water through the pipes. We'll have to run a lot of tests and continue to strengthen the analytics. The idea is with all the information through Civitas, it would be able to, and with the user's consent, be able to really provide an accurate verification that this person is who they say are. So that helps lower the acquisition cost. Also, it opens up a big pool of people. The other piece of it, though, is around risk modeling. So, whether you're an employer, a healthcare provider, or a lender, you're going to want to know something about like the risk of this person that you are now about to do business with. And so, because we have access to this information with the user's consent, that we'd be able to build models that can allow them to incorporate that into their risk assessment. Whether do I want to give this job to this person? Do I want to offer this sort of health service? Do I want to make this loan? And being able to start modeling. And we've got some amazing data science people that are now in our orbit and are working with us to start to think through, like, what are the features that we need? How do we build these models? What information would we be able to use with user consent to be able to actually build very strong modeling tools so now suddenly not only can you lower your cost of acquisition, you can actually get attractive customers that you could have real kind of LTV with. And then the next piece of it is around intent-based modeling. So also we're using something called goal paths in Civitas to help people establish what are their objectives? What are they trying to achieve? Why do they need these documents? And trying to build out intent-based models to say that, okay, if I hand you this customer, that I can prove their identity and assess their risk. But also, are they going to engage with you? And so suddenly all of these pieces that Atomos brings makes it much more attractive to the service providers to participate in this platform and in this ecosystem. And obviously, the more service providers that are willing to engage, the more interesting and more effective it is to help achieve the overall overarching mission, which is inclusion and participation, and the flywheel starts to move. And so you have more of the displaced populations, the migratory populations that are wanting to engage on our platform because they're getting access to a richer set of services. And the service providers are excited to be on the platform because they're getting access to a group of people that were previously out of their reach. It was just way too expensive to KYC and to verify identities and to risk assess because the data just wasn't there to do that.
And so if I've got it right, Civitas is a nonprofit. So I'm assuming you have to tell me you're looking for donation, grants, funding to come in. And if I've got it right, Atomos is it's a public interest organization, but equally it's got to, at some stage, generate revenue and show a profit. Is that model a fairly typical one, or was it, did you steal that from somebody who was making that model work? Did you invent it? How'd you get to that model?
That's a great question. No, it has been worked quite. Mozilla Foundation is a great example of where they have sort of I don't know if it's set up as a public benefit corporation or a stock-based corporation, but it's also connected to a foundation, which is a nonprofit entity. Now, Civitas, I don't see as a foundation. It's more of a charitable organization that will collect donations from individuals, from funders. So to your point, yes, that not only would the investors expect some form of a market return, but it generates revenues because if you think about it, if I'm a bank and I'm paying, I'm just going to make this up, but let's just say $500 to acquire a refugee or a migrant today because of the lack of information. And now suddenly Civitas and Atomos can hand me somebody for $5. Would I pay $5 for this customer, particularly if I've got some identity assurance and some risk capabilities and some intent-based modeling? Sure. So that $5 or whatever the number ends up being, that also becomes part of a revenue stream back to Civitas. It helps build Atomos' business, and you multiply this across, so many millions of people around the world, then this becomes a very viable business proposition as well. The ideal would be to earn a market return, but also to make Civitas self-sustaining over time, where it's not always dependent on grant funding. And this is another lesson that we've learned from some of these other big digital public infrastructure projects, that without kind of a revenue generating model, they're dependent on either government or multilateral or some form of or private grant-based funding, development bank funding. And so our idea would be over time to wean ourselves from that. So because of the relationship with Etimos, there'd be a steady stream of revenue coming back to Civitas to help stand on its own 2 feet over time.
What the two words that come up in my mind as you're talking about that, one is sustainable. That it's got to, it's searching for grants, looking for donations. I've seen organizations, I'm sure you've seen organizations where that challenge overwhelms the fundamental mission of the organization.
100%. Well, in this environment where there's just a lot less philanthropic funding and humanitarian funding, and in this environment, there's a lot more competition for those scarce resources as well. So having a pathway towards sustainability is very important. And I actually, even in the conversations that we've had with some of the grant makers, they ask the same question. They're like, okay, well, we're going to help fund getting this up off the ground and provide some catalytic capital. What assurance can you give that you actually have built a model that will sustain itself over time? And I do think that that's an important dimension.
And the other one I hear is I'll use the word independence. Maybe there's a better word, but sort of doing it in a way that I could see a real risk of any effort like this becoming captive to a government or to somebody who initially starts off maybe with good motives, but maybe over time, for whatever reason, decides they want to bias the system. They want to gather information they shouldn't. It sounds like you're setting it up in a way that you can stand apart from that where you need to.
So, and there's a couple of dimensions to that, and it's important consideration. So one is the actual technology that we're building itself is built around highly interoperable, but also decentralized identity. So if you think about, I'm the user of Civitas, and I am going through a process in Kenya to renew my refugee identity card or get access to a work permit. I'm providing certain information onto the platform, onto the Civitas platform that is encrypted and then stored locally on the device. So there's no central honeypot of data. I mean, there's metadata that allows for modeling purposes, but every piece of information that you as a user provide when you're using the platform gets encrypted and stored locally. And so now if your device is stolen or it's damaged, you're backed up with whoever cloud provider you're using, and we'll be able to give you, there's a technology we'll be using that will allow you to restore that on a new device. So you can always have access, but there's not like it's going into a central Civitas server. And one of the criticisms of some of the other national DPI systems is they were very centralized. They became, real honeypots for hackers and bad actors. So adhering to these sort of decentralized identity principles. So once you've put it on the platform, you're now building a identity wallet that you can take with you anywhere. You can cross jurisdictions, you can cross countries, and now you have access to this information. And as we build, and this is again with Etimos in the picture with user consent, they might want to be able to information of past banking relationships or, telecom accounts that they've had and information that could be valuable from an alternative data perspective. If they wanted to encrypt health records and put them all into digital wallet that is portable and secure, that they are the ones that control who they give access to. Now, when the actual user decides, okay, I want to get this work permit, I'm going to provide this credential, and then it will be de-encrypted on the government platform. Now, the government now is that data. But the user has decided they wanted to provide that data. And then it will be subject to the government's data protection laws and everything else. But it's really the user that decides if they want to provide access to that. So it does decrease the risk of surveillance, of having these big central honeypots of data. That's kind of tech by design.
It sounds very networked, and I don't mean just from a technological standpoint, but you're talking to governments, NGOs, banks, employers. If I could see Civitas as an organization, leaving aside all those various networks, what does it look like today?
I have an army of volunteers, so it is
really. Oh, that's an interesting org model.
We have some people who are commenting, few, but most of them, myself included, are volunteers that are doing this because we're trying to make a difference in the world. But like 3 people on the ground in Colombia who are all doing this, kind of, I think their expectation and hope is that they'll eventually get paid for the work, but they believe very deeply around the work we're doing. And 2 of them were actually former USAID people that were built out programs in the market and trying to resurrect some of that work through this platform. We've got a team that's been incredibly helpful from an engineering group that just is that they're so talented, but they're helping build out the digital public libraries and the open source technologies that will be available to governments, and they're doing that on a pro bono basis. And so we've got a number of folks that believe deeply in what we're doing, and have extraordinary skills. Now, eventually, as we get grant funding and larger amounts of equity funding, we'll be hiring our own data scientists, paying program managers on the ground to be able to do this work. But we have like a very large group of people that are helping and supporting us because they believe in what we're doing. I've got boards now. I have a board for Civitas, a board for Etimos. We've got large advisory networks of people that are incredibly accomplished, believe deeply that if we can solve these problems, not only is it a massive move forward in terms of human dignity, but there's an enormous economic advantage, like the countries and economies globally.
And in that complex world, how does a coherent strategy come forward? Or is it a bit more, let's just get the army of volunteers all moving in the right direction and they'll figure most of it out?
I think there's a lot of people that have looked at this space for a long time and understand the issues we're focusing on. And I think where we're able to bring some coherence is around the pathways to get there and then how to sort of knock off one thing at a time. I think even just going from, we were in very conceptual mode or sort of 6-9 months going down to much more concrete pilots, clear ideas of what we need to launch to start gathering data, start getting, sort of showing the impact, getting partners engaged. And it hasn't been as complicated as you would think, actually, because there's a lot of strong voices. I think getting coherence at the government level is a little bit challenging sometimes because there's a lot of voices that have been kind of looking at different pieces of the puzzle.
And I'm really interested in not just what you're doing there, but the whole question of how do you really bring together parties to create system change around very difficult issues. And just a little bit of my learning, I've heard 3 things in what you said that I think is a pretty good sort of very short recipe if you had to come up with one. One is convening. Get the actors in the system together. Second is pathways. We don't have to solve everything, but can we figure out some things that will make it better? And then some enabling actions, whether it's build the technology or change the regulation or whatever it is, some things that begin to move things very tangibly forward. Is that a reasonable kind of high level, if I only had 3 or 4 kind of things to fly by?
I would introduce another variable, which sounds obvious, but I think it's one that many others have fallen short on, and that's listening. So you get meaning, because oftentimes, and I've heard this from refugees themselves, that they're so fatigued by like having been called into so many of these conversations and but people who are doing the convenings really kind of already have their ideas around the solution. And so they're just kind of using it as a way to kind of validate versus like I put the validation on the far end of that path. So you convene, you listen, you absorb, then you start to, propose pathways and get the stakeholders that were part of the convening to sort of align around, that actually makes a lot of sense. And then you go and put something out there that's tangible and do the validation and you continue that loop. And this is something we did with Varo as well in terms of a lot of customer listening, a lot of crowdsourcing of ideas from our customers themselves to sort of say, okay, how do we keep iterating around something that people actually believe in and that's going to have real benefit?
Colin, this is, from my standpoint, there's just so many things I'd love to explore, like the status of the pilots and how do you balance wanting to move fast, but dealing with things like government sometimes that moves slow.
Move slowly, yeah. Well, it's interesting dynamic because I'm finding and again, I have so much time and empathy for the complex issues that different governments are solving, particularly at this point in and there's just so many complex that are happening. But like in Kenya, it's a little more, there's a lot more stakeholders and a lot more people that want to opine. And so things maybe move at a slower pace. Having strong support from NGO voices, multilateral voices that understand the issues, that are real proponents for making change happen has been very helpful. But it kind of, it moves along at a different pace. Now, Colombia, on the other hand, I have to say, if anything, they're pushing us, which, I mean, and the scale of what in that market between, the number of Venezuelan migrants that are across the border, migrants from other parts of Latin America and the world that have come into the country, massive number of internally displaced people inside the country, a real focus on inclusion for underserved communities. And there's a lot of sophisticated thinking around digital credentials, and verifiable credentials can help be part of a future infrastructure. And so if anything, doors keep swinging open in Colombia, where people are inviting us in and they're saying, okay, how do we make this thing happen? And let's do this and let's do that. And it's more a matter of like, okay, we can only do so many things with the resources we have. And so that's been moving at quite a rapid clip. The issues are deep and profound and complex for lots of reasons. And so it's probably a little bit of finding the things that can create some immediate value and then just continuing the process of engaging and building confidence with stakeholders in that market. But, our goal is, get this off the ground, do the proof of concept, show that this works, and that we can build it in a sustainable, repeatable way to go into other markets is going to be very important.
Now, I can imagine one of the enormous challenges must be how do we balance starting in a new jurisdiction, starting in a new place, versus let's get some stuff done here. How are you weighing that up?
Well, I mean, again, it's a little bit of the same thing as when building the bank from the ground up. It's step by step. You cross one rock at a time. And again, it's about getting proof points. It's about building confidence with stakeholders, keeping and maintaining trust with users. It's about funders excited about understanding the possibilities of what we're doing. And so it's really kind of step by step. So, you don't want to look too far ahead, but you don't want to not have an eye towards the decisions you make today, how they could scale over time.
Yeah. Colin, this has been, for me, so really exciting to hear where you're at and where you're trying to get to. I know it's a complex environment, so I'm sure we haven't touched on nearly anywhere near all of it, probably only a very, very small part of it. But is there anything else just as we're sort of wrapping up, anything else you'd like to share with listeners, either about this whole topic we've been talking about or about anything else?
Yeah, I would say that, if people have an interest, if we pique the interest in what we're doing, feel free to reach out. We've got civitasid.org is our website, which we're actually in the process of already redesigning it because it's already out of date 6 months from, because there's just so much happening inside the organization, but there's ways to reach out to us. We also have atomosid.com, which is, talks a little bit about the work, but, it takes a massive community of people to move these things forward. And we don't claim to have by any means all the answers. I mean, we're just learning every day. And the skills, expertise, and passion of people across the world who care deeply about these problems.
Colin, it's a fantastic invitation. So thank you. And I know I've said this to you before, but hopefully it'll ring true yet again. I'm looking forward to hearing where you get to and having you back on the podcast.
Excellent. Thank you so much,
All right.
Belden.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.